The snow fell harder with each step she took, and her arms had gone numb from holding the baby so tightly against her chest. She pressed her cheek to the estate's iron gate, fingers curling into the frozen bars, and if the man on horseback had ridden past even a moment sooner, no one would have found her before morning. "Someone open this gate," she cried out, her voice cracking against the wind. "Please, my child cannot survive this cold." The Duke of Carrow pulled his horse to a sudden stop at the sound of her voice. He had ridden out that night only to clear his head, not to find a young woman collapsed against his own gates with an infant wrapped inside her cloak. "Who let you out here in this state?" he demanded, swinging down from his horse before his boots even settled in the snow. "They did not let me," she said, her breath coming out in broken clouds. "They cast me out. Both of us." He knelt beside her, and when he pulled back the edge of her cloak to look at the child's face, something in his own expression changed completely. He went still, staring at the infant, as though he recognized something in those small features that no stranger should recognize. "Get her inside," he said sharply to the groom running up behind him. "Now, before she loses the child to this cold." As they carried her through the gates of Carrow Hall, she looked back once at the road behind her, the one that had cast her out with nothing but a baby and the clothes on her back. She had no way of knowing that the Duke who just saved her life was about to become the reason her entire past came undone. If you're watching this story right now, tell me where you're watching from, like the video if you're enjoying it so far, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes after. The warmth of Carrow Hall struck her like a blow. After the hours she had spent in the snow, the heat from the hearth in the grand entrance hall felt almost violent against her skin, and she gasped as the footman carried her past the marble floor and up toward the nearest sitting room. "Careful with her," the Duke ordered, his voice sharp enough to silence the murmurs already spreading among the staff who had gathered at the sound of the commotion. "And send for the physician immediately." Catherine Sherborne could barely keep her eyes open, but she would not let go of the child in her arms, not even when a maid reached for the baby to help ease her into a chair by the fire. "I have her," Catherine said, her voice hoarse. "I will not let go." The Duke crouched in front of her chair, studying her face, now that the candlelight revealed her properly. Her lips had turned a pale shade of blue, and her hands, when she finally allowed the housekeeper to peel back her frozen gloves, were raw from the cold. "You said they cast you out," he said. "Who did this to you?" She did not answer right away. Her gaze dropped to the infant sleeping against her chest, a small girl no older than 3 months, her face still red from the wind outside. "My uncle," Catherine finally said. "Mr. Josiah Renshaw. He told me if I did not leave his house by nightfall, he would leave the both of us on the road himself." A woman's voice cut through the room before the Duke could respond. "Nathaniel, what on earth is happening down here?" Lady Beatrice Carrow, the Duke's aunt, stood at the top of the staircase in her dressing gown, her silver hair still pinned from the evening. She descended slowly, her eyes moving from her nephew to the stranger by the fire, and then to the child in her arms. "She was found at the gates," Nathaniel said, "half frozen, with a child." Lady Beatrice's expression shifted the moment her eyes landed on the baby's face, though she said nothing about it. Not yet. Instead, she turned to the housekeeper. "Mrs. Pruitt, have a room prepared at once, and bring warm broth, not tea. Tea will not do her any good in this state." Mrs. Pruitt, a stout woman with kind eyes and a voice that carried authority through the entire household, nodded and hurried off without a single question, though her glance lingered on the child just as long as Lady Beatrice's had. The physician arrived within the half hour, a thin man named Dr. Langford, who examined Catherine's hands and feet with quick, careful movements before turning his attention to the infant. "She will recover," he said finally, addressing the Duke rather than Catherine herself, as though she were already a matter to be managed rather than a woman capable of speaking for herself. The child as well, though another hour in that cold might have ended differently for both of them. Catherine's throat tightened at those words, not from fear for herself, but from the memory of the moment her uncle had shut the door behind her, the sound of the bolt sliding into place still echoing in her mind. "Thank you," she said quietly, to no one in particular, though her eyes found the Duke's across the room. He did not look away. There was something in his expression she could not quite place, a tension behind his eyes that had nothing to do with concern for a stranger's welfare. It unsettled her more than the cold had. "You will stay here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we will discuss where you intend to go from here." "I have nowhere to go," Catherine admitted, the words leaving her before she could stop them. "My uncle made that quite clear." Lady Beatrice stepped forward then, settling into the chair across from Catherine with the ease of a woman who had spent decades managing difficult situations without ever raising her voice. "And the child's father?" she asked. "Where is he in all of this?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Catherine looked down at the baby again, adjusting the blanket around her small shoulders before answering. "She is not mine," Catherine said. "Not by blood. She is my sister's daughter. My sister died 3 months ago, not long after the child was born, and I promised her before she passed that I would never let anyone take her away." The room fell silent. Even the fire seemed to crackle more quietly, as though the house itself were listening. "Your sister," Nathaniel repeated slowly. "What was her name?" "Margaret," Catherine said. "Margaret Sherborne." Something passed over the Duke's face, quick and unreadable, gone before Catherine could name it. He rose from where he had been crouched beside her chair and walked toward the window, his back to the room, his shoulders set in a way that suggested a man working very hard to control his own reaction. "And the child's father," Lady Beatrice pressed gently, though her eyes had not left the baby's face since the moment she entered the room. "Did your sister ever speak of him?" "She never gave me a name," Catherine said. "Only that he was a man she loved, and a man she believed would never be permitted to marry her. She made me promise not to ask further. I believe she was protecting someone, though I never understood who or why." Nathaniel turned back from the window at that, and for a moment Catherine thought he might say something, but instead he simply studied the child again, his jaw tight, his expression carefully composed in the manner of a man who had spent years learning how to hide what he truly felt. "You will both stay at Carrow Hall," he said finally, "for as long as necessary." "Your Grace, I could not possibly impose. It is not an imposition," he said, cutting her off, though not unkindly. "It is a matter of decency. No child should have been left in that cold, and no woman should have been forced to carry her through it alone." Mrs. Pruitt returned with the broth then, along with warm blankets, and a request that Catherine be taken upstairs before exhaustion overtook her completely. Catherine allowed herself to be helped from the chair, still holding the child close, though her legs nearly gave out beneath her from the effort of the night. As she was led toward the staircase, she glanced back once more toward the Duke, who remained standing by the window, his gaze fixed not on her, but on the infant in her arms, as though he were seeing something in that small sleeping face that no one else in the room could see. Lady Beatrice caught her nephew's expression as well, and once Catherine had disappeared up the stairs with Mrs. Pruitt at her side, she turned to him with the sharp, knowing look of a woman who had raised him since he was a boy and could read every thought behind his silence. "Nathaniel," she said quietly, "tell me you are not thinking what I believe you are thinking." He did not answer immediately. Instead, he crossed the room to the small writing desk near the hearth, opened the top drawer, and removed a folded letter that had clearly been read many times before, its edges worn soft from handling. "Margaret Sherborne," he said, more to himself than to his aunt. "I have heard that name before." "Where?" He did not answer her directly. Instead, he stared at the letter in his hands for a long moment before finally speaking again, his voice low and unsteady in a way Lady Beatrice had never heard from him before. "My brother wrote to me 8 months ago," he said. "He told me he had fallen in love with a woman our family would never approve of, and that he intended to marry her regardless of what any of us thought. He never told me her name. He only said that if anything happened to him before he could make things right, I was to find her and make certain she was cared for." Lady Beatrice's face paled. "Charles never mentioned this to me." "He knew you would try to talk him out of it," Nathaniel said. "He knew I might try as well. And you think this child—" "I do not know what to think," he admitted, "but I intend to find out." Upstairs, unaware of the conversation unfolding below her, Catherine settled into the unfamiliar bed with the child cradled against her chest, too exhausted to wonder why the Duke of Carrow had looked at her sister's daughter as though he had seen a ghost. She only knew that for the first time in months, she and the child were warm and safe, and inside walls that would not turn them away before morning. She had no way of knowing that the letter in the Duke's hands carried a name that would change everything she believed about the man her sister had loved, and the child she had sworn to protect. Morning arrived slowly at Carrow Hall, the light spilling pale and gold through the tall windows of the guest chamber where Catherine had finally allowed herself to sleep. She woke with the child still tucked against her side, her small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm that had kept Catherine awake through half the night, terrified that the cold might have done more damage than the physician realized. A soft knock came at the door before Mrs. Pruitt entered, carrying a tray with tea, bread, and a small dish of warmed milk for the baby. "Her Grace's aunt asked that I see to you personally," Mrs. Pruitt said, setting the tray down on the table near the window. "She said you were not to be disturbed by anyone else this morning." Catherine sat up carefully, adjusting the child in her arms. "That is very kind of her." "Kind is one word for it," Mrs. Pruitt said, though not unkindly herself. She busied herself straightening the blankets at the foot of the bed, her eyes flicking toward the infant more than once. "This house has not seen a child in its halls for a long while. Not since the Duke's brother was young himself." "The Duke's brother?" Catherine repeated. "Is he not here?" Mrs. Pruitt's hands stilled for the briefest moment. "Master Charles passed 6 months ago. A riding accident, they said, though there were some in this house who never quite believed that account." Catherine felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the lingering cold from the night before. She thought of her sister, of the man Margaret had refused to name, of the letter she had once glimpsed on her sister's writing desk before Margaret snatched it away and refused to speak of it again. "What do you mean? Some did not believe it?" Catherine asked. Mrs. Pruitt hesitated, clearly aware she had already said more than she intended. "It is not my place to speak on such matters, miss. You would do better to ask the family directly, if you are curious." She left shortly after, and Catherine spent the rest of the morning turning the housekeeper's words over in her mind, unable to shake the feeling that the Duke's reaction to her sister's name the night before had been about far more than simple grief for a lost love his brother once mentioned in a letter. By midday, a maid arrived to inform her that Lady Beatrice requested her company in the drawing-room, once she felt well enough to walk downstairs. Catherine dressed in a gown that had been left for her, simple but finely made, and carried the child down herself, refusing the maid's offer to hold her during the descent. Lady Beatrice sat near the window when Catherine entered, a piece of needlework abandoned in her lap, her attention clearly elsewhere. She rose the moment she saw Catherine and gestured toward the seat across from her. "You look rested," Lady Beatrice said. "That is good. You gave us all quite a fright last night." "I am grateful for your kindness," Catherine said, settling into the chair with the child now awake and watching the room with wide, curious eyes. "Though I confess I do not fully understand why a duke would trouble himself over a stranger found at his gates." "Nathaniel has always had a strong sense of duty," Lady Beatrice said carefully, "perhaps stronger than most men in his position." "Is that the only reason?" Lady Beatrice's gaze moved to the child, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, studying the small face with an intensity that made Catherine's stomach tighten with unease. "May I ask her name?" Lady Beatrice said finally. "Grace," Catherine said. "My sister named her Grace before she passed." "Grace," Lady Beatrice repeated softly, and something in her voice cracked just slightly, though she recovered quickly. "A lovely name." The door opened before Catherine could ask anything further, and the Duke entered, still dressed for riding, his boots dusted with the morning's fresh snow. He stopped short at the sight of Catherine and the child seated across from his aunt, and for a moment the three of them simply looked at one another, in a silence too heavy for the bright room around them. "I did not realize you were awake," he said to Catherine. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough, Your Grace." He crossed to stand near the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that reminded Catherine of a man bracing himself for difficult news rather than delivering it. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "About your sister." "You said as much last night," Catherine replied, "though I do not understand what interest a duke would have in a woman he never met." "That is precisely what I intend to determine," he said. "May I ask when your sister passed, exactly?" "The 7th of September, Catherine said. 3 weeks after Grace was born." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He exchanged a glance with his aunt that Catherine could not fully interpret, though the tension between them was unmistakable. "My brother died on the 2nd of September, he said quietly. 5 days before your sister." The room went still. Catherine felt the words settle over her slowly, each one landing with the weight of something she hadn't allowed herself to consider until this very moment. "You believe your brother was the man my sister loved," she said. The one she refused to name. "I do not know what I believe," Nathaniel said. "But the timing is difficult to ignore. My brother wrote to me 8 months ago, telling me he intended to marry a woman our family would not approve of. He never gave her name. He only said that if anything happened to him, I was to find her and see that she was cared for, along with any child that might come from their union." Catherine's hands tightened around Grace instinctively, pulling the child closer against her chest, as though the words themselves posed some kind of threat. "Are you suggesting Grace is your niece?" she asked. "I am suggesting it is possible," he said. "And if it is true, it changes a great many things, for both of you." Lady Beatrice rose from her seat and crossed to where Catherine sat, kneeling beside the chair, to look more closely at the child's face, studying the shape of her eyes, the curve of her small nose, with the careful attention of a woman searching for confirmation of something she both hoped for and feared. "She has his eyes," Lady Beatrice said quietly. "Charles had eyes just like this, even as an infant. I remember them clearly." Catherine's throat tightened. "My sister never told me his name. She only said he was a good man, and that their families would never allow it. I assumed she meant a difference in fortune, or perhaps in standing. But I never imagined a duke's brother and a woman with no title of her own," Nathaniel said grimly. "Our father would have forbidden it outright had he lived to see it. Charles knew that. It is likely why he never told any of us her name." "Then why come to me with this now?" Catherine asked. "What is it you intend to do?" Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the child, on the small hand now reaching up to grasp at Catherine's sleeve. "If Grace is my brother's daughter," he said finally, "then she is the last remaining heir of this family's direct line. My brother's death left no other children, no other claim beyond whatever comes from this discovery. That is not a small matter, Miss Sherborne. That is everything this family has left." The weight of his words settled over Catherine like a stone. She had come to Carrow Hall seeking nothing more than shelter from the cold, a place to keep Grace safe until she could find some way to support them both. She had not expected to find herself at the center of a question that could reshape an entire noble family's future. "And what becomes of us?" she asked slowly, "if you determine it to be true?" "That depends on what can be proven," Nathaniel said, "and on what you are willing to allow." "Allow?" "Grace is your sister's daughter," he said. "By blood and by law she is yours to raise as you see fit, regardless of what her father's name might have been. I have no wish to take her from you, Miss Sherborne. But if she is truly my niece, this family owes her a place in it, whatever that may come to mean." Catherine looked down at the child in her arms, at the small face that Lady Beatrice claimed resembled a man Catherine had never met, a man who might have loved her sister enough to defy his entire family, only to die before he could make good on that promise. "I made an oath to my sister," Catherine said quietly. "I promised her I would never let anyone take Grace away from me. I intend to keep that promise, Your Grace, whatever proof you may find." Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression then, something that looked almost like respect, though it was tangled with a grief Catherine could not fully name. "I would not ask you to break that oath," he said. "I am only asking for the chance to know the truth. For my brother's sake, and for hers." Lady Beatrice reached out and gently touched Catherine's hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Whatever the truth turns out to be, my dear, you and this child will always have a place beneath this roof. That much I can promise you myself." Catherine did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing at all, only held Grace a little closer as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the weight of everything unspoken settled quietly over the room. The days that followed settled into a strange, fragile rhythm. Catherine woke each morning to the sound of Grace stirring in the small cradle Mrs. Pruitt had arranged near the bed, and each morning she found herself waiting, half dreading, half hoping, for word of what Nathaniel had discovered in his search for proof. It was on the fourth day that the letters arrived. Catherine was in the nursery, humming softly to Grace as she settled her for an afternoon rest, when a maid appeared at the door to inform her that the Duke wished to see her in his study. The tone of the request left little room to decline, and Catherine handed Grace over to the wet nurse who had been engaged to assist her before following the maid downstairs. The study was a room Catherine had not yet entered, lined with tall shelves of leather-bound books and warmed by a fire that crackled steadily against the chill outside. Nathaniel stood behind a heavy desk, several papers spread before him, his expression tight with something Catherine could not immediately name. "You wish to see me, Your Grace?" "Close the door," he said. "Please." She did, and the click of the latch seemed unusually loud in the quiet room. Nathaniel gestured to the chair across from his desk, and Catherine sat, watching him carefully as he gathered the papers into a single stack. "I wrote to my brother's solicitor," he said, "and to the vicar in the parish where Charles spent much of his time before his death. I wanted answers, and I believe I have found them." He slid one of the letters across the desk toward her. Catherine picked it up with hands that were not entirely steady, her eyes scanning the careful script. "This is a record of a marriage," she said slowly, reading the words twice to be certain she understood them correctly. "A private ceremony, conducted by a vicar in a parish 2 counties from here." "Read the names," Nathaniel said quietly. Catherine's breath caught as her eyes found the entry. Charles Edwin Carow, Margaret Ann Sherborne. The date recorded was the 14th of January, nearly 9 months before Grace's birth. "They were married," Catherine whispered. "My sister was married. She never told me. She never said a single word." "She likely could not," Nathaniel said. "If our father had learned of it, he would have found some way to have the marriage annulled, or worse, ensured Charles never inherited a single acre of this estate. Charles knew that. I believe he intended to reveal it once our father passed, but he never had the chance." Catherine set the letter down carefully, as though it might crumble beneath her fingers. "Then Grace is not merely a possible heir. She is your brother's legitimate daughter, born of a lawful marriage." "Yes," Nathaniel said, "which means she is entitled to a place in this family that cannot be disputed by anyone, not by distant cousins, not by the courts, not by anyone who might wish to claim otherwise." The weight of what this meant settled over Catherine slowly. She thought of her sister, hiding a marriage from everyone she loved, carrying a secret so heavy it must have exhausted her in her final months, when illness had already begun to take its toll. "Why would she keep such a thing from me?" Catherine asked, more to herself than to Nathaniel. "I was her sister. I would have kept her secret. I would have protected her." "Perhaps she was protecting you," Nathaniel said. "If our father had discovered the marriage while Charles still lived, he may have gone after everyone connected to Margaret, including her family. Perhaps she believed silence was the safest path for you both." Catherine pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to steady the flood of emotion rising in her chest. Grief for a sister who had carried such a burden alone. Anger at a world that had forced her to hide something so precious. And beneath it all, a flicker of something like relief, that Grace's existence was no longer a mystery, but a truth, documented and undeniable. "What happens now?" she asked. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. "Now I intend to have the marriage formally recognized before the courts, and Grace's status as my brother's legitimate daughter confirmed beyond any question. It will not be a simple matter. There will be those who resist it, particularly among the more distant relations who stood to inherit should Grace's claim never surface." "Distant relations," Catherine repeated. "Such as who?" "My cousin, primarily," Nathaniel said, his voice hardening slightly. "Mr. Everett Calder. He has spent the better part of the last 6 months positioning himself as the likely heir, given that Charles left no known children, and I myself have not yet married. He will not welcome this news." A knock sounded at the study door before Catherine could respond, and a footman entered, to announce that Mr. Calder himself had arrived, requesting an audience with the Duke on a matter he described as urgent. Nathaniel's expression darkened considerably. "Show him in." Catherine rose from her chair, uncertain whether she was meant to remain or excuse herself. But Nathaniel's hand rose in a small gesture, asking her to stay. Moments later, a tall man entered the study, impeccably dressed, his features sharp and calculating, in a way that immediately put Catherine on edge. "Nathaniel," Everett said smoothly, his eyes flicking toward Catherine with open curiosity before returning to his cousin. "I had not realized you were entertaining guests." "This is Miss Catherine Sherborne," Nathaniel said. "She is currently residing at Carrow Hall, along with her niece." "Ah," Everett said, his tone carrying a weight that made the word feel far heavier than it should have. "The child everyone in the village has been whispering about. I confess I had hoped the rumors were exaggerated." "What rumors would those be?" Nathaniel asked, his voice deceptively calm. "That you intend to claim some infant as Charles's legitimate heir," Everett said, "based on nothing more than a woman's word and a resemblance you have convinced yourself exists. I would think a man in your position would exercise more caution before entertaining such a fantastical notion." "It is not a fantastical notion," Nathaniel said, sliding the marriage record across the desk toward his cousin. "It is a matter of legal record. My brother married Miss Sherborne's sister nearly a year before his death. Their daughter is his legitimate child." Everett's expression flickered as he scanned the document, though he recovered quickly, his composure settling back into place like a mask. A curious record indeed. Conducted quietly, far from any witnesses of standing, by a vicar no one in this family has ever heard of. Forgive me if I find the timing rather convenient. "Are you suggesting this document is false?" Catherine asked sharply, unable to hold her tongue any longer. Everett turned his attention to her fully for the first time, his gaze assessing in a manner that made her skin crawl. "I am suggesting, Miss Sherborne, that a woman in your position, with no fortune and no prospects, might find considerable motivation to present a convenient story to a grieving duke desperate for some remaining piece of his brother." "That is enough," Nathaniel said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You will not speak to Miss Sherborne in that manner in my house." "Your house," Everett repeated softly. "For now." The two men stared at one another for a long moment, the tension in the room thick enough that Catherine found herself holding her breath, waiting to see which of them would break the silence first. "I intend to have this marriage verified through every proper legal channel available," Nathaniel said finally. "If you believe the record to be false, you are welcome to challenge it through those same channels. But I will not have you coming into my home to insult a woman who has done nothing but lose her sister and nearly freeze to death, protecting her sister's child." Everett's jaw tightened, though his voice remained maddeningly calm. "As you wish, cousin. I only hope, for your sake, that this story holds up under closer examination. These things have a way of unraveling when too many people begin asking questions." He offered a shallow bow toward Catherine that felt more like a threat than a courtesy, before turning and departing the study without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, and the room seemed to exhale all at once. "He will not let this rest," Catherine said quietly. "No," Nathaniel agreed. "He will not. Which means we must move quickly and carefully if Grace's place in this family is to be secured beyond any doubt he might attempt to raise." Catherine looked down at the marriage record still resting on the desk between them, the ink faded but unmistakable, proof of a love her sister had carried in silence until her final breath. "Then tell me what you need from me," she said. Whatever it takes to protect her, I will do it." Nathaniel met her eyes, and for the first time since she had arrived at Carrow Hall, Catherine saw something in his expression that looked less like duty and more like the beginning of an alliance neither of them had expected to form. 3 days after Everett Calder's visit, a formal letter arrived at Carrow Hall, addressed not to Nathaniel, but to Catherine directly. She recognized the seal before she even broke it open, the same crest her uncle had used on every document he had ever forced her to sign in the months following her sister's death. She read it alone in the nursery, Grace sleeping soundly in the cradle beside her, and by the time she finished, her hands were trembling badly enough that she had to set the paper down on the small table to keep from crumpling it entirely. "Catherine?" Lady Beatrice stood in the doorway, drawn by the sound of Catherine's sharp intake of breath. She crossed the room quickly, her eyes moving from Catherine's pale face to the letter on the table. "What has happened?" "My uncle," Catherine said, her voice unsteady. "He has written to inform me that he intends to petition the courts for guardianship of Grace. He claims that as her closest living male relative, he holds greater legal standing over her than I do, and that my current residence at Carrow Hall proves I am unfit to raise a child on my own." Lady Beatrice picked up the letter and read it herself, her expression darkening with each line. "This is Everett's doing. I would wager everything I own on it. Your uncle would never have thought to challenge this on his own. Not after the way he cast you both out into the snow. He does not want Grace," Catherine said bitterly. "He wants whatever comes with her if the courts confirm her claim to this family. He never cared for either of us. He only sees an opportunity now that there is something worth having." "Then we must ensure he never gets the chance," Lady Beatrice said firmly. "Nathaniel must see this immediately." They found him in the study once again, and Catherine watched his expression shift from concern to open fury as he read the letter for himself, his jaw clenched tight enough that a muscle visibly worked along the side of his face. "He has no legal ground to stand on," Nathaniel said. "Not once the marriage record is properly filed. Grace's legitimacy through my brother supersedes any claim your uncle might attempt to bring forward. Unless he can prove the marriage record false," Lady Beatrice said quietly, "which is precisely what Everett has likely convinced him to attempt." Nathaniel set the letter down and moved to the window, staring out at the grounds below, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "Then we accelerate everything. I will ride to London myself and see the record filed with the courts before either of them has the chance to interfere further." "That could take weeks," Catherine said. "What happens to Grace in the meantime, if my uncle petitions for guardianship before the record is confirmed?" "He will not succeed," Nathaniel said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "I will not allow it." "Allowing it is not entirely within your power, Your Grace," Catherine said, the formality of the title feeling suddenly heavier than it had in days. "The courts may not care what either of us allows." Nathaniel turned from the window, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, something working behind his eyes that Catherine could not fully read. "There is another path," he said slowly. "One that would resolve this beyond any question, and beyond any court's ability to dispute it." "What path?" Catherine asked. "Marriage," Nathaniel said. "If you and I were to marry, Grace's position within this family would be beyond dispute. No court in England would strip a child from the household of a duke and his lawful wife, particularly when that child is already recognized as the daughter of the duke's own brother." The room fell utterly silent. Lady Beatrice's eyes widened, though she said nothing, watching her nephew with an expression caught somewhere between shock and cautious approval. Catherine felt her breath catch entirely. You cannot possibly be suggesting such a thing merely to settle a legal matter. I am suggesting exactly that, Nathaniel said, because it is the surest way to protect her. I have no illusions about what such a proposal might sound like, Miss Sherborne, and I do not offer it lightly. But I have watched you these past days. I have watched the way you hold that child as though nothing in this world could ever convince you to let her go, and I find myself believing that whatever grief and difficulty led us to this point, Grace deserves a family that will fight for her without hesitation. I am prepared to be part of that fight, in whatever form it must take. Catherine's mind raced, torn between the practical wisdom of his words and the unfamiliar, unsettling flutter that had taken root in her chest since the moment he had knelt beside her in the snow. She thought of her uncle's letter, of Everett's cold, calculating eyes, of the courts that might decide Grace's fate without ever once considering what the child herself might need. "This is not a decision I can make so quickly," she said finally. "I would not ask you to," Nathaniel said. "Take whatever time you require, but do not take so much that your uncle's petition reaches the courts before we have secured her protection." Lady Beatrice stepped forward then, placing a gentle hand on Catherine's arm. "My dear, I know this must feel as though the entire world has conspired to rush you toward decisions you never asked to make. But I have known my nephew his whole life, and I have never once seen him offer anything without meaning every word of it. Whatever you decide, know that it will not be a hollow arrangement. Not with him." Catherine looked between them, the weight of the letter still resting on the desk, a reminder of exactly how quickly everything could be taken from her if she hesitated too long. She thought of her sister's voice, the promise she had made beside her deathbed, the vow to protect Grace, no matter what it cost. "I need to think," she said quietly. "Please give me until morning." Nathaniel nodded, though the tension in his shoulders did not fully ease. "Of course. Take whatever time you need tonight. But know that whatever you decide, I intend to leave for London within the week regardless, marriage or no marriage, to see that record filed before your uncle has the chance to do any further damage." Catherine excused herself and returned to the nursery, gathering Grace into her arms and holding her close as the fire burned low in the hearth. She thought of the man downstairs, a duke who had found her freezing at his gates, and had not once, in all the days since, treated her as anything less than a woman worth protecting. She thought of her uncle's cruelty, of Everett's threats, of a world that seemed determined to strip Grace away from the only family she had left. And somewhere beneath the fear and the uncertainty, Catherine felt something else stirring quietly in her chest, something she was not yet ready to name, though she suspected morning would demand she confront it, regardless of how unprepared she felt to do so. Morning came with a stillness that felt heavier than the night before it. Catherine had barely slept, her mind turning over Nathaniel's proposal from every possible angle, and by the time the first light touched the frost on her window, she had made her decision, though the weight of it had not lessened at all. She found him in the breakfast room, alone, a cup of tea untouched before him, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. He rose the moment she entered, his expression searching hers before she had even spoken a word. "I have thought about it through the night," Catherine said, standing just inside the doorway. "And I have decided to accept your proposal, Your Grace. Not because I fear what my uncle might do, though I confess that fear is very real, but because I believe you when you say this is not a hollow arrangement, and because I believe Grace deserves the protection your name can offer her." Something in Nathaniel's shoulders eased, though his expression remained solemn. Then I will send word to the vicar this morning. We will marry as quickly as propriety allows, and I will still ride for London immediately after to see the record filed." Before Catherine could respond, the sound of raised voices reached them from the entrance hall, sharp and urgent enough to draw both their attention toward the door. Nathaniel crossed the room quickly, Catherine following close behind, and what they found in the hall stopped them both cold. A man Catherine had never seen stood near the entrance, his coat still dusted with travel, a leather satchel clutched in one hand. Mrs. Pruitt stood before him, clearly attempting to bar his path further into the house, though he showed no sign of backing down. "I have official documents from the county magistrate," the man said firmly. "I am here on behalf of Mr. Josiah Renshaw to serve notice of a guardianship petition regarding the infant currently residing in this household. You will not serve any such notice in my home without my presence," Nathaniel said, striding forward with an authority that made the man pause mid-sentence. "I am the Duke of Carrow. State your business properly, or leave." The man straightened, clearly recalibrating his approach now that he stood before the master of the house rather than the housekeeper. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. I have been sent to inform Miss Catherine Sherborne that a hearing has been scheduled before the county magistrate in 5 days' time to determine legal guardianship of the child known as Grace Sherborne. Mr. Renshaw has requested the child be presented at that hearing." Catherine felt the floor shift beneath her, though she forced herself to remain steady, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. 5 days. That is far sooner than any letter suggested. Mr. Renshaw's solicitor moved quickly to secure an early date, the man said. "I am merely the messenger, miss. I have no stake in the outcome." Nathaniel took the documents from the man's outstretched hand, scanning them with a controlled fury that Catherine could feel radiating off him even from several feet away. 5 days does not allow sufficient time to travel to London and have the marriage record properly filed before the courts. "Then we do not have 5 days to spare," Catherine said. "We must marry before that hearing and find some other way to have the record recognized in time, or Grace's fate will be decided by a magistrate who knows nothing of her true parentage." Nathaniel folded the documents and handed them back to the messenger with a curt nod. "You may tell Mr. Renshaw that his petition will be answered in full and that he will find considerably more resistance than he anticipates." The man departed without further argument, clearly eager to be free of the tension that had settled over the entrance hall like a physical weight. Once the door closed behind him, Nathaniel turned to Catherine, his expression grim but resolute. "We will marry tomorrow," he said. "I will speak with the vicar this afternoon and secure a special license. It will raise questions, given how quickly it must happen. But I care little for questions when Grace's safety is what hangs in the balance." "And the marriage record?" Catherine asked. "If we cannot reach London in time—" "I will send a rider ahead with sworn statements from myself, from Aunt Beatrice, and from the vicar who conducted your sister's original ceremony, along with the record itself," Nathaniel said. "It will not be as strong as presenting the case in person, but combined with our own marriage, it should be more than sufficient to establish Grace's legitimacy before the magistrate." Lady Beatrice appeared at the top of the staircase then, having clearly overheard enough of the commotion to understand what had transpired. She descended quickly, her expression a mixture of alarm and steely determination. "I will accompany you to the hearing myself," she said. "A woman of my standing, testifying to the child's resemblance and the family's acceptance of her will, carry weight with any reasonable magistrate." "Thank you, Aunt Beatrice," Nathaniel said. "We will need every advantage we can gather." Catherine excused herself to check on Grace, who had begun to fuss in the nursery, and found herself grateful for the small task, a moment to steady her breathing before the whirlwind of preparations consumed the rest of the day entirely. She lifted the child into her arms, pressing a kiss to her small forehead, and made a silent vow that no magistrate, no uncle, and no scheming cousin would ever succeed in tearing them apart. The wedding, when it finally happened the following afternoon, bore none of the grandeur Catherine might have imagined for a duke's marriage under different circumstances. It took place in the small chapel on the estate grounds, attended only by Lady Beatrice, Mrs. Pruitt, and a handful of trusted staff. The vows exchanged quickly, but with a sincerity that surprised Catherine more than she expected. Nathaniel's hand had been steady as he slid a ring onto her finger, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity that spoke of promises deeper than the practical arrangement that had brought them to this moment. Catherine found herself searching his face for any sign of regret or hesitation, but found none, only a resolve that matched her own. "You are now the Duchess of Carrow," the vicar said finally, closing his book, "and this child is recognized before God and this household as the daughter of the late Charles Carrow and niece to the Duke." Grace, held in Lady Beatrice's arms throughout the brief ceremony, chose that exact moment to let out a small, curious sound, as though she understood the weight of what had just been decided on her behalf. Catherine could not help the soft, unexpected laugh that escaped her, the first genuine moment of lightness she had felt in what seemed like months. But as the small gathering dispersed and preparations began for the journey ahead, a messenger arrived at the estate gates, breathless from hard riding, carrying news that stole the fragile relief from Catherine's chest entirely. "Your Grace," the messenger said, addressing Nathaniel directly, his expression grave. "The hearing has been moved. Mr. Renshaw's solicitor has petitioned successfully to have the date advanced. The magistrate will hear the case tomorrow morning, not in 5 days, as originally stated." Catherine's blood ran cold. Tomorrow. They had barely secured the marriage, and now there would be no time at all to send word to London, no time to gather further proof beyond what they already possessed. Nathaniel's jaw set with grim determination as he turned to face her. The weight of everything they had built in the span of a single day suddenly balanced on the edge of a single, unforgiving morning. The chapel bells had barely stopped ringing when the household descended into a frenzy of preparation. Catherine sat in the drawing room with Grace held tightly against her chest, watching Nathaniel pace before the fire, his mind clearly working through every possible avenue that remained to them before morning. "We cannot reach London in time," he said, "and we have no fresh witnesses to call beyond what we already possess." "Then we use what we have," Lady Beatrice said firmly, entering the room with a stack of papers gathered from the study. "The marriage record, the vicar's original testimony, your own sworn account of Charles's letter, and now the marriage that took place this very afternoon. It may not be everything we hoped to assemble, but it is far from nothing." Catherine looked down at Grace, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, utterly unaware of the storm gathering around her small life. "And if it is not enough? If the magistrate sides with my uncle regardless?" "It will not come to that," Nathaniel said, though his voice carried the strain of a man trying to convince himself as much as her. Sleep did not come easily that night, and by the time the carriage arrived to carry them toward the magistrate's courthouse the following morning, Catherine felt as though she had aged years in the span of a single week. The county hall stood cold and imposing against the grey morning sky, and as they climbed the stone steps, Catherine caught sight of her uncle waiting near the entrance, Everett Calder standing just behind him with an expression of quiet satisfaction that turned her stomach. "Catherine," her uncle said, his voice dripping with false warmth, "you look well." Marriage clearly agrees with you. Do not speak to me as though you care for my welfare, Catherine said coldly. You cast us both into the snow without a second thought. A difficult decision, he replied smoothly, made for reasons you never fully understood. But we are here now to settle the matter properly, before the law. The hearing began promptly. The magistrate, a stern-faced man with sharp eyes that missed nothing as both sides presented their claims. Catherine's uncle spoke first, painting a picture of a destitute niece incapable of providing for a child, a woman who had fled to a duke's household out of desperation rather than any legitimate claim to nobility. When it came time for Nathaniel to speak, he rose with the same quiet authority Catherine had witnessed the night they first met at the gates of Carrow Hall. He presented the marriage record between his brother and Margaret Sherborne, the sworn testimony of the vicar who had conducted the ceremony, and finally, the certificate of his own marriage to Catherine, performed only the day before. This child, Nathaniel said, his voice carrying through the entire hall, is the legitimate daughter of my late brother, Charles Carrow and Margaret Sherborne, lawfully married before God and witnesses nearly a year before her birth. She is my niece by blood, and now my daughter by law, through my marriage to her aunt. There is no petition Mr. Renshaw can bring that supersedes that truth. The magistrate studied the documents carefully, his expression giving nothing away, and the silence that followed stretched long enough that Catherine felt her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. Mr. Renshaw, the magistrate said finally, do you dispute the authenticity of this marriage record? Everett stepped forward before Renshaw could answer, his composure finally beginning to crack. We do, Your Honor. We believe the record to be fabricated, arranged hastily to secure an inheritance that rightfully belongs elsewhere. A serious accusation, the magistrate said. One that requires serious proof. Do you have any evidence to support such a claim? Everett hesitated, and in that hesitation, Catherine saw the entire foundation of his scheme begin to crumble. He had built his case on doubt and insinuation, never expecting the marriage to have occurred so quickly, never expecting Nathaniel to move with such decisive speed. I have none beyond my own suspicions, Everett admitted finally, the words clearly costing him a great deal. Then this court finds no legal grounds to remove the child from the custody of the Duke and Duchess of Carrow, the magistrate said. Grace Sherborne Carrow is recognized as the legitimate daughter of Charles Carrow, and her guardianship rests entirely with her aunt and uncle. This petition is dismissed. Catherine felt the breath leave her body all at once, relief crashing over her so completely that her legs nearly gave out beneath her. Nathaniel's hand found hers, steadying her, and when she looked up at him, she saw the same overwhelming relief reflected in his own eyes. Her uncle's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence entirely drained away, while Everett simply turned and walked from the hall without another word, his ambitions thoroughly defeated by a truth he had never expected to find so solid. You will not trouble us again, Nathaniel said to Renshaw as they passed him on their way toward the doors. If you attempt anything further against my family, you will find the full weight of this house prepared to answer for it. Renshaw said nothing, only lowered his eyes and stepped aside, and Catherine felt something long clenched inside her chest finally begin to loosen as they walked out into the pale morning light together. The carriage ride back to Carrow Hall passed mostly in silence, though it was a silence far gentler than any that had come before it. Grace slept peacefully in Catherine's arms, unaware of how close she had come to losing everything, and Catherine found herself studying Nathaniel's profile as he stared out the window, marveling at how completely her life had transformed in the span of little more than a week. Thank you, she said quietly. For all of it. I do not know how I could have protected her without you. Nathaniel turned to face her, his expression softer than she had seen it in days. You do not need to thank me, Catherine. I did not do this merely out of duty to my brother's memory. I did it because, somewhere between the night I found you at those gates and this very moment, I came to care for you both far more deeply than I ever anticipated. Catherine's breath caught at the sincerity in his voice, and she realized, with a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the carriage's small fire, that she felt precisely the same. I did not expect to find anything but shelter when I came to your gates, she admitted. I certainly did not expect to find a family. Nor did I expect to find one waiting for me, Nathaniel said, reaching over to gently touch Grace's small hand where it rested against Catherine's arm. But I am endlessly grateful that I did. When they arrived back at Carrow Hall, Lady Beatrice met them at the door, her eyes searching their faces for news before either of them could speak a single word. Whatever she saw there was answer enough, and she pulled them both into an embrace, laughing and crying all at once as the household staff gathered to celebrate the news. That evening, as snow began to fall softly outside the windows of Carrow Hall, Catherine stood by the nursery window, with Grace in her arms, watching the flakes drift gently down over the grounds where she had once collapsed in desperation and fear. The same snow that had once threatened to take everything from her now fell peacefully over a home that had become truly hers, in every sense that mattered. Nathaniel joined her at the window, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders as they watched the quiet snowfall together. And for the first time since her sister's death, Catherine felt something she had feared she might never feel again. She felt safe, she felt loved, and she felt, at last, entirely home.